Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the top news stories from around the world. I'm Siddhantani and with me in studio as always is Prashant from People's Dispatch. Today is Tuesday and we're talking about stories from Lebanon, from Yemen, from the US and Europe. First up, in Lebanon, where on October 14th, 7 people, including a woman, were killed and dozens wounded when gunmen attacked a protest in Beirut's Tayoune area. Reports say members of the armed group Lebanese forces were responsible for the incident. There's also a video of a soldier firing at the protesters, and the army has pledged an inquiry. Meanwhile, Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah delivered a powerful speech yesterday. Prashant, welcome back to your own show.
Thank you.
Let's start with the protest from a few days ago. Who were these protesters and what was happening and why were they attacked in the first place?
Right. Of course, I think almost everyone would remember the Beirut blast last year in August 2020, which caused a huge amount of damage, destroyed large sections of Beirut. So there's been an inquiry going on for quite some time. And right now, the inquiry is being headed by a judge called Tariq Bitar. Now, certain sections of the Lebanese political establishment feel that Bitar, in his pursuit of corruption, and in terms of finding out who was responsible for this massive amount of ammonium nitrate which caused the blast being stored in that port. So that was illegal. So who was responsible for that? So a lot of sections are feeling that Bitar has been very selectively targeting Hezbollah and more importantly their allied party called Amal, which represent largely the interests of the Shia population. So there's been this very strong feeling. So Hezbollah and Amal have been demanding that Bitar no longer be associated with the inquiry. So on October 14th, it was a very peaceful protest that was taken out with this demand. And what happens at this point, personnel members of the Lebanese forces, like you said, it's important to know that the Lebanese forces is a fascist group. So they have been involved in a lot of massacres in the Lebanese civil war in the 70s and 80s, including this infamous Sabra and Shatila massacres of Palestinians. It is well known that they're supported by Israel. They're directly funded by Saudi Arabia. They're reported to have the backing of the United States. Their leader, Samir Jaja, was in jail for a long time on a number of assassination and murder charges. So this is the group we're talking about, not your run-of-the-mill political party, but an outfit with a horrible record of violence, which has been known to be a player of, or known to be a front, and known to be an agent of various other countries. So members of this group fired at the protesters. Like you said, nearly 7 people were killed. There were incidents of counter-firing. The military was also probably involved in terms of some of the firing, maybe. Like you said, there's a video of a soldier. There's probably an inquiry going on. But as we know, Lebanon is already facing a variety of crises. And this kind of really brought things to the head, so to speak, because there is a very delicate balance right now in the country stemming from the end of the civil war. Right. The civil war was very brutal, often fought on sectarian lines and non-sectarian lines as well, but also on sectarian lines. And it was with a great deal of difficulty. And a more important thing, of course, was that a lot of foreign countries were involved with their agenda, especially countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So it was a great deal of difficulty that peace was established. So an incident like this definitely, bringing things further to a risk at this very vital time. So the key question here, of course, is what is going to happen in the next few days. People are hopeful, observers are hopeful, and hoping that there is no large-scale breakout of violence. People are comparing it to the infamous massacre in 1975, which led to the start of the civil war as well. So a lot of questions before various Lebanese political sections right now. But the important thing, like I said, is to note and to remember that this was very clearly an incident of Hezbollah and Amal protesters being fired upon by what is essentially a fascist group. Now, the media, especially in the West, might try to portray it in some other way. They have this whole picture of Hezbollah, but these are the facts on the ground and need to be remembered.
Right. So, in this context of what we might say is rising sectarian tension, what did the Hezbollah chief have to say in his speech yesterday?
So, Hassan Nasrallah made a very powerful speech, and one of the key things he pointed out was that he made a very clear distinction, and he pointed out that the Lebanese forces group, which tries to portray itself as a defender of Christians, is not so. Right. So one of his key points was to say that it's clear who Lebanese forces is. They are supported by the following countries. There are allegations that they have worked with ISIS in the past, and Nasrallah made a point to say that when Christians in Iraq were under attack by the Islamic State, it was not Lebanese forces who defended them. In fact, like I said, there were allegations that Lebanese forces were working with them. Whereas on the other hand, it was Hezbollah's forces, it was Hezbollah's allies who fought the Islamic State against it. So what I think Nasrallah was trying to do was at one level to sort of diffuse the sectarian element to this and not make it a fight between sectarians, various religious or ethnic sections in the country, and it's always been very clear for him, for Hezbollah as a whole, that imperialism, or what we call imperialism, is a very key issue here. The fact that the United States and many other countries are playing a massive and vested role in this region is very obvious. We know what's happening in Palestine, with Israel. We know what's happening with Iran. We know what's happening with Saudi Arabia, and the positions the United States is taking. So Lebanon actually kind of comes in the middle of all this, and that is really one of the reasons for the crisis. And we know that Israel especially has been long out to sort of destroy Hezbollah. They tried in 2006 in Lebanon and they failed very miserably. And since then, Hezbollah's strength has only grown. So he also made it a point. I think for the first time he said that they have 100,000 armed militia persons who are ready to mobilize. So that was also in some ways a declaration of strength, a warning, but also a very clear sign that at least from Hezbollah's perspective, they do not want this Lebanon to go down into a sectarian conflict-like situation, because there is a strong suspicion that many of these moves are engineered by foreign players who have, like I said, their own interest definitely on all this. So really, I thought it was a bit of a balancing act. On the one hand, a very stringent speech, because he also made a point to say that there will be an inquiry, justice will be delivered, talking to the people, talking to his own cadre, his own members who are probably shocked at these massacres, who want justice, so making that very clear. But also on the other hand, sending out a message to other communities saying that this is not the direction we want to take. So a very interesting response from Nasrallah. It remains to be seen in the coming days how, like I said, how each of these sections is going to balance out these forces. We know that, like I said, the United States also has a vested interest in making sure that Hezbollah is weak, or Israel has it, because Hezbollah is a vital ally of Iran. They are very powerful. They played a huge role in Syria. So they're an ally, for instance, of the Palestinians as well. So they have an interest in weakening Hezbollah. So it's important to see how Hezbollah responds to the situation, how it chooses to mobilize, how it chooses to take actions.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that update, Prashant. News from Yemen now, where the Saudi-led coalition forces claim to have killed over 160 Houthis advancing on the city of Marib. This is the last foothold in the north of the country of the internationally recognized government. Prashant, this push by the Houthis has been on since Feb. What's going on? What is the status on the ground?
Right. It's interesting that we are coming to Yemen after Lebanon, because just as Lebanon, in some senses, is a front in the US war against Iran, so to speak, so is Yemen. And we know that the Houthis and the deposed president, I don't know if we can really call it a government anymore, the Western government, because the president is out of the country, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. His forces, and which are backed by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, a lot of other countries in the region, it's actually a big coalition, and who were implicitly, in terms of supplies, backed by the United States and UK until recently. So those forces have been fighting with the Houthis since 2014. The foreign intervention came in 2015. So for 6 years, we've seen Yemen being bombed to the dust, for lack of a better word, by these foreign forces, especially the Saudi Air Force, very brutally bombing all of these areas. Nonetheless, the Houthis have won some major victories. In 2014, they captured the capital, Sana'a, so which means large parts of the north of the country are under their control. So the Hadi's regime is more in power in the south. So Marib is an important city because it's one of the key centers in the north, which is still under the Hadi regime's control. And like you said, this offensive has been going on since February. Latest reports indicate that the Houthis are actually very, very close to capturing it. Only the city of Marib itself and an adjoining district are supposed to be in Hadi's hands. We don't know what the situation is, for instance, by the time this show comes out itself. So what we are seeing is a very, very closely fought battle. The Houthis definitely having an edge. The Saudi announcement regarding the killing of 165 Houthis sounds to me, it might actually have happened, but still sounds to be a bit of propaganda to sort of reverse, or to sort of counter the exact direction in which the war is taking place. So key question here, because if they capture Marib, it will be a massive strategic victory for the Houthis. There have been some talks of peace over the past many months. They're not really, really got into anything at all. So, and it's also true that for peace to happen in Yemen, there has to be a larger regional process of dialogue and negotiation that happens. So until then, unfortunately, even this war in Marib is causing a huge amount of human rights, massive human rights crisis. I believe 10,000 people displaced in the last month alone. There are already tens of thousands of people who from other war zones came to Marib because it was a relatively secure and safe area, and now they're also in risk. The latest numbers, I think, across Yemen are that I believe 2/3 of the population requires humanitarian aid, which is a massive number. I think it's about just close to 20 million or something. So pretty depressing numbers and overall horrible situation in Yemen right now. So we need to see if the next few days bring some kind of peace after this, or the conflict continues after Marib is captured, which is most likely what is going to happen.
And how do you look at this conflict in the larger sort of strategic situation in the region?
Right, so which is why I mentioned that you cannot really, the war in Yemen is very difficult to sort of end without a larger regional process. And the fact is that the Houthis have close ties to Iran. On the other hand, the Saudi Arabia, the UAE have directly and very obviously been involved in fighting against the Houthis. They have been, they're directly militarily involved. There is no evidence of, for instance, Iran being directly militarily involved in Yemen, whereas the Houthis, the Saudis are. And the UAE, of course, has been backing another section of the same alliance. So right now what we see is basically that this has become some kind of a regional playground as well for various regional interests to sort of play their agenda. One major development that happened in recent times, a couple of years ago, was when the Houthis managed to send drones into Saudi Arabia and attack some of the oil fields. And that really sort of, shook the game, because it's one thing for the Houthis, of course, to target the Hadi forces or their opponents in Yemen. But the fact that they were able to take attacks into Saudi Arabia itself, into the landmass of Saudi Arabia, was a real shock. There have been a lot of talks about, speculation about discussions that are going on. For instance, a while ago, the leaders of all these countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, all of them met in Iraq itself under the initiative of Iraq. There were talks of discussions going on to, extend a ceasefire that was briefly in place for a while. And like I said, it's essential because of the nature of the humanitarian crisis. The UN called it the worst humanitarian crisis of the century. And if 2/3 of the population, which is in need of humanitarian aid, the number of people who are direly in need of food is increasing almost by the millions, so to speak. And every day, of course, but also every couple of months, you have a million more people in dire need of food who are not getting it. The Saudi regime also blockaded the port of Hodeidah, which has caused a huge amount of trouble for the Houthis where they're trying to bring in food. So all this together, and of course, like I said, the Saudi air raids, and many of them, there are already cases of war crimes which have been filed against many of these countries, and many allegations that are there because the Saudi air raids often targeting civilians, like air attacks everywhere in Afghanistan, for instance. But what we're seeing is a complete destruction of the infrastructure, of the quality of life, of the future of the people of Yemen in the name of some proxy wars that are taking place. So what Saudi Arabia really has a lot to answer for, especially on this. So it remains to be seen if the negotiations work out, what are the kind of dynamics that are going to be played. Yemen has a long history of conflict, unfortunately. But right now, looking at the fighting, it does not look like the ceasefire is really working very well, or if it's happening in other parts of the country. So the real question is that will people, the UN and other agencies be able to bring aid? Question of money as well. Apparently aid agencies are running out of money, which is what the UN envoy has said. So that they're not in a position to bring food to as many people as they want, as they should, technically. So difficult situation all around. The strategic position of Yemen as being a neighbor of Saudi Arabia very important to this, because we need to understand it in that context as well. So the Saudis and the Emiratis pushing all out for in what is basically looks like a losing war. It's one of it's considered, it was something Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia very aggressively went into in 2015. But over time, it has seen further and further setbacks in terms of how they're faring in the war. So like I said in the last question, very a bit of a real stalemate. People of Yemen suffering.
Yeah, suffering direly actually. Well, on the subject of suffering, we're talking next about TRIPS and COVID-19. And from October 9th to the 13th, activists organized actions to pressure the European Union and various European countries to support the TRIPS waiver proposal, pointing out that people continue to die because governments do not want to stand up to Big Pharma. Earlier in the year, in his opening statement at the 76th UN General Assembly, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that the pandemic had shown two sides of humanity. Ingenuity on the one hand in the creation of all of these vaccines, but the lack of political will and mistrust among nations to get the vaccines to everyone. He was, of course, talking about COVID-19. We spoke earlier to Anna Vakar from the People Health Movement about what's going on in Europe and what were these actions to pressurize the European governments.
From October 9 to October 13 this year, health activists in Europe organized a series of actions and protests called the Days of Shame around the recent meeting of the TRIPS Council at the World Trade Organization. The actions were associated with a number of movements here in Europe. So one of them was the European Citizens Initiative Right to Cure, which is a formal initiative for citizens of the EU to campaign for equitable access to vaccine around the world. So this kind of week of action was organized to support the recent negotiations that went on at the WTO around the TRIPS waiver. And the issue was and remains that a number of European countries, among them Germany, which has a lot of influence on the European Commission and on the position that the European Commission takes at the WTO, they are still refusing to support the TRIPS waiver, and by doing so they are actually making it harder for people in the global south to access vaccines, although European countries have a lot of doses secured, and it is quite probable that by the end of the year a lot of their doses will actually be expiring. So as part of the week of actions took place in Switzerland, in Austria, in Norway, but also outside of Europe, as activists from MSF and from other organizations met in South Africa in front of several embassies of European Union countries, for example Belgium, and they all called for the EU and the other countries to support the TRIPS waiver. The actions differed in size and in outreach. For example, in Geneva, there was this protest on October 13th, which was also the central event of the Days of Shame. It was a smaller protest called at the main train station in Geneva, and activists from Switzerland, but also from France, from Italy joined the protests and called the countries that met at the TRIPS Council to support the TRIPS waiver. A few days earlier, there was a bigger protest going on in London, which was coordinated by Global Justice UK. This meant that around 60 people met and they marched through the center of London. They kind of pretended it was a funeral, and they used the opportunity to call the UK government and Prime Minister Boris Johnson in particular to call them out for their responsibility for so many COVID deaths that have happened over the past year because the UK refused to support the TRIPS waiver. And then there were also actions that were not protests, but they were more interactive and more local. Let's say in Vienna, for example, in Austria, a group of grandmas and grandpas met for a vigil that went on for several days. And they were also calling out European governments for their impact on the world during the COVID-19 crisis. Then there were also actions that did not take place physically, but they had a lot of outreach. For example, one of the International Union Confederations the one of transport workers called the International Transport Federation. They published an open letter to European governments, to European heads of state, underlining that transport workers and other workers were heavily impacted by COVID-19, and they wanted a fair solution to what we are going through now, and that a fair solution means that everyone all over the world has equal access to COVID-19 vaccines. And of course that European governments should do everything that they can to make that happen. And then finally, since the protests had quite a good impact, the European Citizens Initiative and also all the other organizations and movements that support it have decided to continue organizing in the weeks and months to come. First on the list are two actions that will take place in Italy this week already. It is two protests, of which the first one will happen on Wednesday, 20th October. It will happen in Rome, and it is supported by the local organization of the European Citizens Initiative, but also of the NGO Emergency, which provides healthcare in situations of conflict, and also one of the bigger trade union confederations in Italy, CGIL. And then afterwards, the whole initiative and the groups that support it will meet for actions at the end of November, when the next meeting of the WTO is. And it will again be an opportunity to show that the people of Europe support the TRIPS waiver, and that we demand our governments to support it too.
Right, and finally, General Colin Powell, former US Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, died due to complications from COVID-19. He was 84 years old. Powell played several crucial roles in Republican administrations and helped shape US foreign policy in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Prashant, from My Lai to two invasions of Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people killed. Some might be celebrating the life of Colin Powell, but for the rest of the world, there's a legacy of death as well.
Right. So like the common parlance, of course, is don't speak ill of the dead, but in cases like this, there's really no helping it, because Colin Powell, unfortunately, was involved in some of the biggest war crimes that the world has seen in this century and in the previous one.
Yeah.
So we know you mentioned My Lai in Vietnam, where he as a young soldier was involved in torching villages using chemical compounds, and in Iraq twice, like you said. One of the most disgraceful incidents, of course, was in 2003 he gave a speech before the United Nations where he urged war on Iraq, citing that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. You know, he gave a lot of information. A lot of people were convinced by it because he had this aura of being a respectable person, unlike the other people in the Bush administration, right? So a lot of people convinced by it. Later, of course, it turned out that all of this information was fake. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was crystal clear. People had been saying it for ages. So over 1 million people killed in Iraq over the decades by both sanctions and direct warfare. An entire country destroyed, completely destroyed. The rise of groups like the Islamic State, all of that comes from the US invasion in 2003. So today, when the United States pontificates about terrorism, the real question to ask is, hey, who asked you to go to Iraq over there? There was, at that point, nothing. There was no terrorism, so to speak. But the thing is, of course, Colin Powell being celebrated for his achievements. He was the first black Secretary of State, and he had a high position in the military. But the real question we need, probably the best answer to this is Muqtada al-Saidi, who threw a shoe at George Bush in 2008, so he made a very straightforward, simple, poignant comment that his biggest regret was that Colin Powell died without ever facing justice.
Right.
And that's true of Donald Rumsfeld, that's true of Dick Cheney, it's true of a lot of people, unfortunately, in the Bush administrations, in the Obama administration, the Trump, Biden administrations, and in future administrations to come, who supervise US war crimes across the world but will probably never face justice.
Yeah. A recurring theme also for us on this show as we sort of explore the impact that has all over the world and especially into the global south.
Right.
That does it from us for today. Thanks, Prashant, for your time. We'll be back again, same time, same place tomorrow. You've been watching Daily Debrief. For more context and all the behind the headline stories, go to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and follow us on social media. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.